Hey, everybody. Welcome to another episode of The Bitter Pill. So, it's been quite a while since I've done a video. It's been a combination of being a bit busy and just a little bit tired. I don't have any energy today because I couldn't sleep last night. And I finally caught a nap this afternoon, so I decided to do this. But anyway, without further ado, let me get to today's topic or topics. Since it's been a while, I did want to cover a few different things, but I'll try to do it succinctly. So, briefly, what I wanted to do today was talk about the recent International Court of Justice case brought brought by South Africa accusing Israel of genocide. And so I'm going to summarize what South Africa's case was and summarize the ruling that the judges made regarding the case. And basically, if you don't know, the way that the World Court, as it's also called, works is that it takes quite a while, often years, to make a final ruling on cases brought before the ICJ. And in the meantime, though, the ICJ can make interim rulings, preliminary rulings, in cases where delaying a decision of some sort in the case would result in great harm. So, obviously, if genocide is being committed, then it's unconscionable to wait years to make a ruling on whether it is or not. So, in this case, South Africa asked, and the ICJ granted a preliminary ruling that called on Israel to stop its actions that South Africa argued constituted genocide. So, briefly, what I want to do today is summarize South Africa's case. What's the evidence that the lawyers from South Africa brought forward that Israel was committing genocide in Gaza? I want to summarize the ruling that the ICJ made. I want to discuss reactions to the ruling, which there was a variety of reactions. So many people were very happy about the ruling. And on the other hand, some media outlets emphasized the fact that the ICJ's ruling didn't call for an immediate ceasefire in this ongoing military action of Israel in Gaza. And also, there were a number of supporters of the Palestinians, as well as Palestinians themselves, who were critical of the fact that the ICJ didn't demand an immediate ceasefire. And then finally, I want to talk about what's happened in the aftermath of this ruling, both in terms of what Israel's actions have been and in terms of the propaganda campaign, basically against the UN, that was mounted immediately upon the ICJ's ruling. Now, the International Court of Justice, like the International Criminal Court, is a branch of the United Nations, as is what's called UNRWA, the UN. I forget what it stands for, but basically the agency that provides assistance to refugees in Gaza and the West Bank, which, particularly in Gaza, most of the people living there were refugees even before the last 4 or so months of Israel's military campaign. So, first of all, let's talk about the the case that South Africa brought. Now, this was an 84-page document that left no stone unturned in terms of presenting evidence, both that Israeli political leaders and military personnel expressed a clear intent to commit genocide, and also documenting the actions that Israel has taken that it was argued constitute genocidal acts or failure to prevent genocide. And anyway, let me go ahead and present this. Okay, so it's interesting that South Africa was a country that brought this case because, of course, South Africa, like Israel, has a history of apartheid. And of course, that's where the term apartheid comes from, is the system of racial segregation and oppression that existed in South Africa up until the early 1990s. And human rights groups and many, many others have made the case that Israel, too, is an apartheid state. And in fact, many folks from South Africa who were around when there was apartheid in South Africa and are knowledgeable about the situation in Israel/Palestine argue that the situation is even worse in Palestine than it was in apartheid South Africa. Anyway, so they say this application concerns acts threatened, adopted, condoned, taken, and being taken by the government and military of the State of Israel against the Palestinian people, a distinct national, racial, and ethnical group, in the wake of the attacks in Israel on 7th October 2023. South Africa unequivocally condemns all violations of international law by all parties, including the direct targeting of Israeli civilians and other nationals, and hostage taking by Hamas and other Palestinian armed groups. So, whatever you may think of the views of the South African government about this, it's pretty clear that they're not taking the side of Hamas here and not criticizing them or something like that. Yeah, as I've discussed before on this show, it's questionable to what extent there was direct targeting of Israeli civilians on October 7th, as opposed to, actually targeting of Israeli civilians by the Israeli military under the Hannibal Directive, where basically it's a policy that calls for the Israeli military to try to prevent by any means possible Palestinian fighters from taking hostages, or folks from other places such as Hezbollah in Lebanon, which is also taken Israeli soldiers hostage before. So, as we've talked about on the show before, hostages were taken by Hamas and other Palestinian armed groups because Israel took a much larger number of Palestinians hostage, essentially, imprisoned them either without charge or under questionable charges that basically boiled down to any form of resistance, even minor things like liking a Facebook post or something like that, to the Israeli apartheid regime. So from Hamas and Palestinian Islamic Jihad and other Palestinian armed groups' perspective, taking hostages was the only way that they could have leverage to get Palestinians held in Israeli jails released. Okay, anyway, that's kind of a side issue. Let me just go through the evidence that South Africa presented that Israel is committing and condoning and encouraging acts of genocide and what impact those acts have had. And the South African legal team presented this evidence about what Israel has done and what Israeli leaders advocated in exhaustive detail. So, for instance, one thing they pointed out was, of course, as most everyone knows by this point, tens of thousands of Palestinians have been killed since October 7th in Gaza and to a lesser extent in the West Bank, although the genocide case pertained to Gaza. And, many times that number injured. Almost 2 million out of Gaza's population of 2.3 million made refugees rendered homeless by the severe damage or destruction of their homes or the threat to their lives that caused them to flee toward the south of Gaza, which isn't safe either. And Israel's bombing campaign has been described as one of the heaviest conventional bombing campaigns in the history of modern warfare. In just over 2 months, they say, this case was filed toward the end of December, so about 2.5 months after Israel began its attack on Gaza. Israel's military attacks had wreaked more destruction than the razing of Syria's Aleppo between 2012 and 2016, Ukraine's Mariupol, or proportionally, the Allied bombing of Germany in World War II. Because, of course, Gaza is a much smaller place than Germany. And the destruction certainly was quite severe in Aleppo and Mariupol during the Russia-Ukraine war, etc. So they say, since the start of Israel's military operation, more than 15,000 people have reportedly been killed, over 40% of whom were children. Thousands of others have been injured. Okay, I kind of covered that. And those numbers are, of course, much greater than that, a month and a half after this data was collected. They also point out the healthcare system in Gaza is collapsing. Hospitals have turned into battlegrounds. Only 14 hospitals out of 36 facilities are even partially functional. It's less than that now. So there's been a systematic attack by Israel on the healthcare system in Gaza. So not only are people getting severely injured en masse, but they often don't have treatment available to deal with their injuries. So there have been cases of amputations without anesthesia, and pregnant women have had to get C-sections without anesthesia because there's basically no medical supplies. Uh, there's really no hospitals to speak of. Lots of doctors and nurses and so forth have been killed. So it's quite horrible. Another thing that Israel has done is completely, or to the extent possible, cut off, excuse me, got a bit of a cold here. I don't think it's COVID. I think it's cold, judging from the symptoms. Still sucks. But anyway, Israel has, ever since October 7th, tried to prevent aid from coming into Gaza, medical supplies, food, water, etc. And Gaza is very dependent on outside aid because the numerous attacks on Gaza that have taken place in the past, several times since the early 2000s, Israel is engaged in massive bombing campaigns as well as invasions of Gaza. Not as destructive as this one, but destructive enough that they've basically completely wrecked Gaza's ability to sustain itself economically. So destroying crops and agricultural land, destroying water supplies, water treatment plants, and so forth. Obviously, destroying food production and so forth. Limiting electricity, and all of that's gotten worse. So basically, hardly any food, water, medicine, fuel, and electricity, which of course energy is necessary to make a society run. And I think I said medical supplies as well. Basically everything that Palestinians in Gaza need, Israel has tried to cut off as much as possible. And there's a trickle of aid coming in, but it's a tiny fraction of what was coming in before October 7th. And even that was inadequate because Israel tried to limit the amount of aid coming in even before. So I forget his name, but one Israeli official said, we're going to put Gaza on a diet. We're going to limit food supplies to just the amount needed for them to survive, and that's it. So, there already was a lot of malnutrition in Gaza even before Israel's attack. And so about 85% of the population of Gaza has been internally displaced by the bombing campaign and the brutal attacks on civilians by the Israeli soldiers who have invaded Gaza, who really don't do much to fight the Palestinian armed resistance because it's difficult to get to them. They have tunnels that they can hide in buildings and so forth. So it's a guerrilla war, and Israeli soldiers are getting picked, and military equipment like tanks are getting picked off right and left by the Palestinian armed resistance. So basically, these cowards, the Israeli quote unquote defense forces, go after civilians rather than engaging directly with Hamas and the other groups for the most part. And they've done so throughout Gaza. So basically, they bombed the north and ordered people to flee their homes under threat of death through bombing or whatever if they didn't, which of course that's clearly illegal under international law. But anyway, so most of the population of the northern half of Gaza has fled to the south. They get bombed there too. They get attacked there too. So, in fact, Israel lied to people saying, well, we go to the south if you want to be safe. And then they've ordered them to flee from places in the south to the very extreme south on near the border with Egypt. And as South Africa points out, they've been reduced to living in makeshift tents, often not even real tents, just tarps or whatever, in camps with no water, sanitation, or other facilities. There's no fully functioning hospital left in the northern part of Gaza. And, well, since this case was filed, things have gotten worse. There's no fully functioning hospital left in South Gaza either. Contagious and epidemic diseases are rife amongst the displaced Palestinian population, with experts warning of the risk of meningitis, cholera, and other outbreaks. Of course, COVID is presumably a big problem because it's the most contagious disease out there other than measles, which most people are vaccinated against. But Palestinians, generally speaking, aren't vaccinated against COVID because Israel tried to limit vaccinations of Palestinians. So for those of you who claimed that the vaccinations are harmful, if that were true, why would Israel try to stop Palestinians from getting vaccinated for COVID? They wouldn't. Anyway, they say the entire population in Gaza is at imminent risk of famine, whereas the proportion of households affected by acute food insecurity is the largest ever recorded, according to the Integrated Food Security Phase Classification, IPC. Okay, let's see if I can find some specific statistics about that. Okay, I filled you in a little bit on the background of how Israel treated Gaza before October 7th. So basically, there was a strict blockade, entry and exit of people as well as goods by air and sea to Gaza has been prohibited since the early 1990s. They shut down the airport and they closed down most of the crossings through which goods could come between Israel and Gaza. And just in general, limited the ability of aid agencies to bring stuff in via Israel or Egypt as well. As long ago as 2015, the United Nations Conference on Trade and Development warned that the measures imposed by Israel risk Gaza becoming uninhabitable by 2020, which, basically that's what happened, but it's much, much worse now. So, the South African case relies a lot on evidence from UN bodies. Overwhelmingly, that's what they rely on in making their case, both about what's happened in the past as well as what's happened since October 7th. So Israel, even as far back as 2000, according to a UN Human Rights Inquiry Commission, already had destroyed a lot of homes, uh, destroyed a lot of agricultural land in Gaza, which is, I mean, the amount of agricultural land isn't high to begin with. They've destroyed water wells. They've uh, demolished homes and olive and citrus trees and other crops. So, yeah, they've just really wreaked havoc even before October 7th. Another thing that Israel has done a lot of prior to October 7th, 2023, and it's even worse now, is that routinely Palestinians detained in Israeli prisons have been tortured, often sexually assaulted, and they describe a number of specific types of torture that human rights groups, such as the UN Special Rapporteur on the situation of human rights in the Palestinian territories, they report that since 1967, torture of various sorts has been commonplace in uh, Gaza and the West Bank. They also point out that, you know, contrary to this myth that you hear quite often, that there was a ceasefire in Israel and Palestine, or between Israel and Hamas et al. Uh, prior to October 7th. In fact, about 200 Palestinians had been murdered by Israeli soldiers or by settlers in the West Bank, um, and some in Gaza as well, and thousands had been injured. Save the Children, a human rights group that focuses on the welfare of children, uh, had already declared 2023 the deadliest year for Palestinian children in the West Bank since 2005. And that's only escalated both in the West Bank and of obviously in Gaza since October 7th. Okay, so next they present evidence of the various acts that Israel has been documented to have engaged in that constitute genocidal acts in Gaza since October 7th. So, of course, killing Palestinians, overwhelmingly civilians, like more than 90% civilians, um, in very large numbers. If you count the number buried under the rubble and presumably dead, it's well over 30,000 at this point. Um, so, eliminating through just outright murder a large proportion of a population is, of course, the act of genocide that we're all familiar with. So, more than 1% of Palestinians in Gaza have been killed since October 7th. The second element of genocide is causing serious bodily and mental harm. So, injuring people, causing them to develop post traumatic stress disorder, uh, and when we're talking about injuries, often it's very severe injuries, such as having arms and legs blown off or things like that. Uh, and Israel is through things like cutting off food, water, medicine, etc., inflicted conditions of life intended to bring about the destruction of Palestinians as a group. And examples of that include expulsion from homes, making the vast majority of the population refugees, destroying people's homes, their neighborhoods and apartment buildings and so forth, deprivation of access to adequate food and water, deprivation of access to adequate medical care, a deprivation of access to adequate shelter, clothes, hygiene, sanitation, destroying elements of Palestinians' life in Gaza. So schools and universities, churches and mosques, uh, government buildings, all these things have been destroyed by Israel. And imposing measures intended to prevent Palestinian births. So, uh, the rate of premature births among pregnant Palestinian women in Gaza has skyrocketed. They don't have adequate food, so they can't really nurse in many cases. If they can get water at all to make formula with, so they can feed their infants, it's typically contaminated. So the infants get diseases. Um, and just creating a huge level of post-traumatic stress. So they talk about details of how Palestinians in Gaza have been killed and where. Killed in their homes, killed in um, shelters where they sought refuge, in hospitals, in schools, churches, mosques, everywhere they've taken refuge. And they often get shot at while they're trying to find food and water for their families. They've been killed if they fail to evacuate and stay in the north, for example. They've been killed in the places that they fled to in the south, and they've been killed en route, even though Israel has told them, okay, these routes are safe. We won't attack you if you go on these safe routes to places in the south where it's safe, which is all lies. There are more and more reports of mass executions of Palestinians through just rounding people up and shooting all of them. So it's not only the bombing; it's direct assassinations of people by Israeli troops. I mean, not that it matters how they're killed, but the point is, there's all sorts of ways they deliberately kill people. Um, Even people waving white flags, clearly unarmed, trying to let Israeli troops know they're no threat, are still shot dead on sight. And that includes a case of 3 Israeli hostages who apparently escaped from their Palestinian captors. Okay, let's see. Okay, so there's lots and lots of details in this document. I'll share a link to it in the video description. I just wanted to get to what it said about food and water deprivation. Israel has now pushed the Palestinian population in Gaza to the brink of famine, with international agencies warning that the risk of famine is real and is increasing each day. Most of the people in Gaza are now starving, with levels of starvation rising daily. UN Secretary General, I'm sorry, I forget, Tedros, whatever his name is, said 4 out of 5 of the hungriest people anywhere in the world are in Gaza. And Palestinians in Gaza are facing the highest levels of food insecurity ever classified by the IPC, the organization that monitors hunger worldwide. The World Health Organization says about 93% of the population in Gaza are facing crisis levels of hunger. And about 500,000 people are like catastrophic levels of starvation. So they're in danger of dying from hunger soon. By 16th of November 2023, the food infrastructure in Gaza was already considered no longer functional. Bread is scarce or non-existent, with food scarcity leading to significant price hikes, and the price of flour increasing by 65% at one stage. Livestock that has not been killed is facing starvation, and crops are damaged or destroyed. So, as I pointed out to some Zionist who was vegan the other day, which that's some pretty fucked up contradiction and beliefs that you care about animals, but dehumanize and hate an entire group of human beings. Um, you know, if you actually care about animals, you should care about the fact that animals in Gaza, as well as humans, are starving. There's also almost no clean water available in Gaza. Um, it just goes on and on. And the second part of South Africa's case is documentation of uh, genocidal statements or incitement to genocide by Israeli government officials. So, in the interest of time, I'm not going to go into a lot of detail on this, but basically, just dehumanizing Palestinians, calling them animals and whatnot. Um, saying, we're going to wipe them all out. We're going to clear them all out of Gaza, push them into the desert so we can settle Gaza, take over the land, and so on and so forth. Okay, so what did the court decide? So basically, and I'll put this document in the video description too, although they did not rule that Israel should immediately cease its military operations, which was part of South Africa's demands for interim measures, they did say basically Israel has got to stop engaging in all these acts that I mentioned that constitute acts of genocide, or excuse me, they've got to, they've got to stop engaging in genocidal acts. They've got to stop making statements such as Palestinians are human animals, and we're gonna wipe them all out, death to the Arabs and so forth. They've got to stop encouraging genocidal acts and supporting them, and so forth. So there have been a number of reactions to these recommendations. So one common reaction in Western mainstream media was to harp on the fact that excuse me, the ICJ, the World Court, did not order a ceasefire. So here's an article from the New York Times. Some headlines, you basically didn't even mention what the court ordered Israel to do, but emphasized that they didn't order a ceasefire. So basically, they're trying to imply somehow that the court ruled in Israel's favor, which clearly is not the case. However, there were also quite a few Palestinians and supporters of Palestinians who were upset that the court didn't order a ceasefire, but at the same time, there was also quite a bit of sentiment to the effect that if you order Israel to stop mass murdering civilians, if you order them to allow food and water and so on and so forth to come in, stop restricting it, and so on and so forth, then basically the only way that those measures can be implemented is if there is a ceasefire. So you can't have people bringing in aid en masse if there's a good chance that they could get killed as they're bringing it in. And in fact, there have been many cases where Israel has shot at or bombed or whatever folks bringing aid in, as well as people going to trucks that have brought food in or what have you, shooting them when they try to access that aid. So, a lot of people basically argued that this was, a positive step. In fact, unprecedented positive step. So Ali Abu Nima, for example, says, Ali Abu Nima, the founder of Electronic Intifada, which does great work in covering events in Palestine, says, my initial impression is that the ICJ ruling is a huge defeat for Israel, both in substance and by the lopsided votes. ICJ did not order a ceasefire, but ordering it, among other things, to stop killing members of the group, it is effectively so. The most respected and authoritative international court has ruled that Israel is plausibly accused of genocide. In other words, although they can't, at this early point, decide, yes, Israel is guilty of genocide, they did decide that South Africa's allegations were plausible. That is, there was a ton of evidence presented that they were valid allegations. And it ruled Palestinians are at grave risk of irreparable harm from potentially genocidal acts, which Israel must halt. And that was a common reaction. This is like really the first time that Israel has been held accountable for anything that got widespread popular support. So the ICJ has ruled against Israel before. So they ruled, for instance, that Israeli settlements were illegal and they needed to stop that and so forth. And nothing happened because it was basically ignored by the international press. But now that there's a worldwide movement to try to stop Israel's genocide, bring about a ceasefire, and work toward freedom for Palestinians. The ICJ ruling this time, it has a different context, and one indication of that is how lopsided the vote was on each of the specific claims made by South Africa. So there were 17 judges on the International Court of Justice, and they voted by margins of like 15-2 or 16-1, with in most cases one of the two votes against being, as you might imagine, the Israeli judge. But even the Israeli judge didn't vote against South Africa's claims in every case. Some of them he supported. So, for instance, he supported the call by South Africa for aid to not be restricted. Interestingly enough, there was a judge from Uganda that voted against all of the measures, but surprisingly enough, quite a few of the judges were from Western countries, including the chair of the panel of judges, who was from the United States, and in the past, was a lawyer in the State Department. They overwhelmingly, regardless of where they were from, voted in favor of South Africa's calls for Israel to stop doing this or that act of genocide or inciting genocide and so on and so forth. I don't think this would have happened if there weren't enormous political pressure from the grassroots throughout the world for this decision to be made, for this case to be supported. In fact, prior to the trial, Norman Finkelstein, who, as you probably know, is a very well-known scholar of the conflict in Israel and Palestine, considered to be one of the top political scientists in the world, he predicted before the trial started that the case would lose, or at best, it would win with a very, very slim majority. And as he acknowledged, he was quite wrong about that, and he was, of course, quite happy to be wrong. Okay, so what else has happened? Different reactions to the verdict, but as far as what's happening on the ground in Palestine, Israel's genocide, at least at the moment, is continuing unabated. Hundreds of people, between 100 and 200 typically, being killed every single day, overwhelmingly civilians. All the other things I mentioned are still happening. There's still not much food or other necessities getting into Gaza. So Israel's still trying to, commit genocide at this point. Um, and it'll be interesting to see what Israel will say, if they say anything, when they are required to make a report on measures they've taken to um, stop what they're doing and stop inciting their genocidal scale violence. Um, a month from now, when they're supposed to make a report, if they, in fact, comply with the requirement to report at all. I'm not sure what they're going to say. They didn't have much to say in their defense in the hearing, other than, as you might guess, accusing South Africa of being anti-Semitic, and claiming that the case was without merit, and talking endlessly about the Hamas-led attack within Israel on October 7th, which, of course, is irrelevant, because no matter what anybody does to you, as a country, committing genocide is not an appropriate response, regardless of what was done to you, even if it was genocide. And obviously it wasn't. The evidence suggests that at most a few hundred Israeli civilians were killed by Palestinian fighters on October 7th. A large number also killed by friendly fire, as Israel was trying to regain control of the area around Gaza, the military bases and settlements and so forth, as well as try to prevent the Palestinian armed groups from taking hostages. So anyway, clearly not anything remotely approaching the scale of violence of Israel on Gaza committed by Palestinians on October 7th. So anyway, one really interesting thing happened on the same day that the verdict was issued. So Israel claimed, on the same day as the ruling against them, that 12 of the 13,000 or so employees of the UN Relief and Works Agency for Palestinian Refugees, which that's the largest employer in Gaza, because Gaza residents are so dependent on aid from other countries just to survive, because their economy has been devastated by Israel over the years, and especially since October 7th, but even before then. So Israel claimed that 12 of those 13,000 workers were involved in the Hamas-led assault on southern Israel, according to the New York Times. And the response to that allegation, which you can see here, somebody who's a columnist for the New York Times went even farther than the editors of the New York Times, and said basically abolish UNRWA, which that's really overwhelmingly the only game in town as far as substantial amounts of humanitarian aid and assistance in Gaza. Bret Stephens said abolish the UN's Palestinian Refugee Agency. And several countries, including the United States, immediately cut off their funding of UNRWA. So Let's see if I can find a list here. Japan, Germany, and Italy. Huh. Interesting set of countries there. Cut off their aid to UNRWA. Several other European countries, besides Germany and Italy, also cut off their aid. Canada did. The United States did. And we're talking about hundreds of millions of dollars. The majority of the funding for UNRWA was cut off by these Western countries with honorary members of the Western imperialist countries like Japan. Um, you know, basically, if it wasn't already obvious from the fact that Israel is only able to wage its genocidal campaign in Gaza because of the weapons it gets from the United States and to a lesser extent the UK and Germany and various other countries. Um, you know, so Western countries are complicit in Israel's genocide in that respect, but now they're directly participating in trying to starve the people of Gaza. So I think the list is up to like 16 countries now that are saying they're going to cut off aid to UNRWA, and the commissioner, the head of UNRWA, Philippe Lazzarini, says that UNRWA may have to cease operations in Gaza at some point by the end of this month if funding isn't restored. So he says 9 countries have, as of today, temporarily suspended their funding to UNRWA. These decisions threaten our ongoing humanitarian work across the region, including and especially in the Gaza Strip. It is shocking to see a suspension of funds to the agency in reaction to allegations against a small group of staff, especially given the immediate action that UNRWA took by terminating their contracts and asking for a transparent and independent investigation. So UNRWA actually, and a lot of people have criticized them for this, and I find it problematic as well. They basically fired the dozen or so UNRWA workers who were accused of collaborating with the Palestinian armed resistance on October 7th. They fired them before there had even been an investigation. And yet, even bending the knee to that extent did not result in countries like the United States, the UK, Canada, etc., not cutting off UNRWA's funding. They did it anyway. So this was, a useless and harmful gesture. Let's see. Okay, I don't have it called up. It doesn't look like, but Aaron Mate wrote an excellent article about the suspension of UNRWA funding. So I'll just share a couple of quotes with you from that. So Aaron says, according to the Washington Post, the Biden administration's decision to suspend UNRWA's funding was made so quickly that it came in a matter of hours after receiving a so-called dossier from Israeli intelligence. The U.S. rushed to support Israel's allegations, despite acknowledging that it hadn't bothered to scrutinize them. So, kind of a mirror image of what UNRWA did, taking action before evidence had been gathered. The U.S. cut off funding without even knowing anything about whether Israel's allegations, which, remember, Israel is the country that probably lies more than any country in the world, including the United States, the claims of 40 beheaded babies and mass rapes and Palestinians accidentally bombing their own hospitals, as opposed to Israel targeting one after another hospital, as well as invading them with troops. Um, and on and on and on, and a whole rhetoric about Hamas supposedly using human shields, which, as I've discussed before, there's no evidence of that. So why should we believe this very conveniently timed allegation against UNRWA? They can't even keep their story straight. They're now saying that only 4 UNRWA workers, again, out of a group of 13,000 employees in Gaza working for UNRWA, were allegedly associated with the Palestinian resistance's actions on October 7th. Now, mind you, even though certainly I would agree with the South African legal team that any harm done to civilians, Israeli civilians, on October 7th, that should be condemned. It's not okay. Even so, as the ICJ itself, I believe, has ruled in the past, countries that are under military occupation, or territories that are under military occupation, such as the West Bank, or in an indirect sense through controlling everything that comes in and out Gaza, have the right to armed resistance against their oppressors. So, it wouldn't be a wise decision for employees of UNRWA to be getting involved with the armed resistance. It doesn't look good for an aid agency if they've got employees who are taking up arms against Israel. They have every right to. Just as any other Palestinian has the right to engage in armed resistance against the brutal Israeli occupation of Palestine and their genocide against Palestinians. Another thing Aaron points out is regarding what these allegations were based on. And he says the credibility, quote unquote, of the allegations was soon eliminated by Israeli officials, who admitted that a lot of their so-called intelligence about UNRWA was a result of interrogations of militants. Anyone familiar with Israeli practice understands that such interrogations are a euphemism for torture. Perhaps for that reason, a New York Times article laundering the Israeli claims omitted any mention of the interrogations that produced them. Now, there are a number of countries that haven't cut off aid to UNRWA, even in Europe. Belgium, Spain, Ireland, Scotland, which is part of the UK, several other countries, even in Europe, haven't cut off funding to UNRWA. And I'm not sure how much funding comes from countries in the global south, probably not as much by any means as what comes from the West. But you don't see those countries cutting off aid. So Israel's claims about UNRWA employees supposedly participating in the October 7th uprising not only rest on very questionable evidence, but they can't even get their story straight. So just today, they changed how many UNRWA employees they said were involved in October 7th from 12-4. And then there was an article in the Wall Street Journal written, interestingly enough, by or co-authored by a former Israeli soldier. Um, yeah. Uh, Gosh, what was I going to say? Oh, claiming that as many as 10% of UNRWA employees were involved with Hamas. Of course, providing no evidence that that's true. Um, so, you know, there will be an investigation of this, as I guess there should be. But at this point, there's no solid evidence for this. Um, okay, so what's going to happen next? It's hard to say, but just briefly, if we look at the military situation, Israel's getting his ass kicked in Gaza by Hamas and the other armed resistance groups. Um, and much higher casualty figures. Uh, a number of sources, such as figures on soldiers hospitalized with injuries, suggests that Israel is paying a heavy price for its invasion of Gaza. Hundreds of tanks and other military vehicles have been destroyed or too badly damaged to be, or badly damaged enough to be temporarily rendered inoperable. So the resistance is going strong in Gaza. There's also the cutoff of ships going to Israel to trade with Israel by the Ansar Allah group, the so-called Houthis in Yemen. Basically, what's happening there is that they happen to border on a strait, very narrow strait through the Red Sea that everybody has to pass through in order to reach Israel or the Mediterranean Sea from the south. And basically, they're preventing most ships that are bound for Israel from getting there. And there's been efforts to stop the Yemenis from doing this by the U.S. and UK and other countries, bombing in Yemen and attacking Yemeni boats and ships and so forth. But Yemen's not going to stop doing that. And now, in fact, because of these attacks, they're going after ships from the U.S. and UK, preventing them from getting through the I can't remember what the name of the strait is that goes into the Red Sea. But so significant amount of trade from countries, either Israel or countries that are supporting Israel, or some of them anyway, is not being allowed through the Red Sea. And on the other hand, countries like Russia and China and so on and so forth, their shipping is basically fine. The Yemenis have no reason to mess with that because these countries, are not supporting Israel's genocide. There's also, increasing attacks from Hezbollah, the powerful Lebanese armed resistance group, much stronger than Hamas, which itself is kicking Israel's butt. Basically, nobody can live in the north of Israel because of the conflict there between Israel and Hezbollah. Armed resistance groups in Iraq and Syria are attacking U.S. military bases, also firing missiles into Israel, as of course are the Hamas fighters. So Israel's having to fight a multi-front war, um, and it's not going well for them. Um, they're really being kind of backed into a corner. So, it's hard to say what's going to happen. Um, I guess one uh, quasi bright spot is that the U.S. Just today, I believe, said it was going to impose sanctions on Israeli settlers who attacked Palestinians in the West Bank. Uh, so, so I guess you know that's something that perhaps the U.S. government has done as a result of external pressure to slightly limit their support of Israel's genocide. But in basically every other respect, supplying weapons and um, cutting off um, aid to aid to Gaza and so forth. They're very much continuing to double down on their support of Israel's genocide. And so basically, what you have is this situation where, on one hand, you have the West, the imperialist countries, supporting Israeli fascism and genocide, and the vast majority of countries in the global South oppose what Israel's doing. And there's increasing mass protest and civil disobedience and so forth going on in various Western countries. Time will tell what's going to happen in the long run. It's not looking good at all for Biden's reelection, largely because of its support for Israel's genocide. So we'll have to see what happens. Unfortunately, I don't think anything very significantly positive is going to happen within the next couple of months or so. Unfortunately, we're going to continue to see hundreds of Palestinians dying every day just from Israel's military action. Probably more than that, resulting from starvation and disease. In fact, that's probably already the case. Some experts argue, but at the same time, there's also indications that another ceasefire may be on the way, in which there will be an exchange of hostages, and certainly the Hamas militants are arguing for a permanent ceasefire. So we'll see what happens. Hard to know. But anyway, that's where things stand at the moment. And I will see you next time. Hopefully before as much time goes by as did before I did this video. All right, please like and subscribe and share the video. As I said, I will put some links in the description. And I will see you next time. Take care.